Today, we are going to have two expert sessions in the morning and in the afternoon. Karl Ian Cheng Chua, Ph.D., will give the first expert session today. He will teach us about publishing as a Southeast Asian academic. Let me read a short biography about him. Karl Ian Cheng Chua, Ph.D., received his master's degree in Japanese Studies from National University of Singapore, his doctorate in social science from Hitotsubashi University. He is currently an assistant professor of the Department of History at Ateneo de Manila University and former director of Japanese Studies program. He is also a country representative for the steering committee of the Japanese Studies Association of Southeast Asia, or GSA ASEAN. He has written on boys manga during Showa period Japan and Philippine comics. Ladies and gentlemen, please give our warmest applause for Karl Ian Cheng Chua, Ph.D.
Great, thank you. First and foremost, I'd like to give my gratitude to Uli for actually inviting me. The topic is something that I hold a little bit personal in the sense that it's still a struggle for me. And as we were hearing Milani Sensei yesterday, something that you have to also understand is even for us, we are actually also struggling still. So your journey is not as different as ours. When I wrote this, I was actually still, when I wrote this and did research on this, I was actually still recovering from what I would call academic trauma, in the sense that the realities of the introduction is I am a Filipino doing Japanese studies, which means that the realities of my space is I am a peripheral person in a further peripheral space. Right? So it's I'm not going to be telling you what you're going to do, but I'm actually going to give you some realities that you need to understand in this space itself. So first and foremost, we do know that there are geopolitical inequalities in your spaces. You have to also experience that even with your own departments, wherever you are, where unconsciously we will say, oh, this whatever major is not as good as opposed to our departments. But think of that type of situation above. Within a more global level itself. It's not only within your own institution, but it's actually happening in the world. So what now happens if you are Southeast Asian in a minor department, right? So the odds are really against you. The other thing here is it's always dominated by North American scholars, which means that we're now dealing, especially for us. And yes, I will also include myself, even if the reputation in Southeast Asia is Filipinos speak good English. What you will realize in publishing is, despite the fact that you are writing in English, it's not their English. Right? We are actually using a lot of terms which have been constructed and evolved by our cultures and societies. And it's something that you should not only recognize, but you should also embrace and insist on. That's why yesterday, in some of the sessions that I was in, I will not correct your Englishes, but I will then ask you to define what you mean by it, right? Because you will then look at the contexts of why you are using particular terms. Right? But it's not only in English itself. Even you'll also notice it when you write in Bahasa, right? They will tell you, oh, this bahasa is Java bahasa or something, right? And so, but the idea here is for us to also recognize these things and recognize that there are inequalities even within our own spaces. Lastly, there has been the prevalence. I'm not sure about its organization in UI itself, but that's why I said that I am from a Japanese studies program, which means that between me as a historian doing children's literature, I am not seen as valuable by the history program because of my identity as a Japanese studies major. Okay? So you have that also problem, which you will see, especially in your own research, because if you are area studies majors, the issue that happens usually is they ask you for theory. They ask you for what is your method, what is your theory and concept, and most of the time, theories are based on the disciplinal grounding, right? Without recognizing that even area studies itself, I mean the idea, and I'm not pushing you all to area studies, okay? The idea of the area studies is we're looking at everything in order to create our conclusions. So we are both, and that's why for me in Japanese studies, they find me out. Because my focus is on children's literature. So why aren't you a lit person? Why aren't you in the children's? Why aren't you doing a lot of children's literature? Why aren't you in the lit program? Or why aren't you just writing your dissertation on children's literature, on literature itself? Yeah. So the idea here, and that's where, as what Milani Sensei mentioned yesterday, then that's what creates my gap. That I'm not actually just a lit major. I'm also integrating a lot of history concepts and history discipline principles within my own research. So much so that it creates some attraction to me as opposed to just working with a lit person. Next slide, please. So we begin first with centers, and that was it. There is geopolitical inequalities, which means that you now are, if you wish to play that game, then you have to satisfy those conditions. Your English, you have to change your Englishes. You have to ground yourself in the theories of the stronger discipline, right? So, in other words, when you're then wanting to publish in a history journal, you have to use history theories, popular history theories, and so on, right? But that's not the only alternative, considering that we're teaching you how to study, how to publish in any spaces. The next one, although I don't like this term by Ben Abi, publishing in semi-centers, which means that we have to recognize that Anglo-American spaces are not the only spaces we can publish in, right? And this is much more stronger if you're an area studies major, which means that your center is your area. If you're a Russian major, then you can now have the capacity not only to publish in English, but also in Russian. In my case, I also have the capacity to publish not only in English, but also in Japanese. But it also gives you the capacity to publish in spaces where this area is strong, right? So if you've gone to conferences and you've seen a Spanish university that is strong in literature, in Japanese literature or whatever, then you can engage in that space, right? It's not going to be top tier, but it is a center. And that's what they label as semi-centers itself, right? But here is where we have problems. I mean, you are now changing the language that you are publishing in, but semi-centers, in order to legitimize themselves, still use centric models, right? So in other words, you're just renegotiating your theories, but you're now renegotiating it in a different language. However, the nice thing about them is you also open yourself up to the theories of that semi-center. Right? In my case, if we assume that I'm a Japanese studies major, I'm not only going to take English language theories and frameworks, I can now tap Japanese language theories and framework itself, right? Which opens the field, but it also limits you to, okay, so what are now important thinkers in this space, right? Because those are your gateways towards these concepts. But once again, I mean, we have now, I've sort of given you these two spaces, semi-centers and centers. What will then be a problem with us? And this is something Anissa and I talked about on the drive here. Can we collaborate with centers or semi-centers? The problem with them, as the term suggests, is that, especially if you're from a periphery, they're not interested in you. Right? In most situations, when you sort of go to these centers, unless they're nice people, because there are also nice people in this world, you say like, oh, I read your book, I'm really inspired by it. Is there a possibility for us to do a collaboration between this and an Indonesian, whatever, and so on? And if they're nice, then they probably say yes, but in most situations, unfortunately, this is the realities of centers and semi-centers. They're like, right? They usually look at it not because you're not doing something bad, but as we have been criticizing about a lot of these exercises, part of the reason why we publish is because we're wanting rankings, right? And in most situations, unfortunately, semi-centers and centers, once they collaborate with you, they sort of think that they're pulling themselves down, right? So don't look at it as your scholarship is bad. But again, the issue here is that they also have their own worries as well. And, but it doesn't mean that they won't. In my own career, I've always been lucky enough to have gone to conferences wherein a very distinguished faculty just listened to your talk and was interested, like, oh, wait, I never thought of it in this perspective. Because they are not looking at it from a peripheral lens. And then they invited me to publish in special issues with them. But these are more of a lucky situation as opposed to a common thing. And that's why one of the things Manami Sensei mentioned yesterday was attend conferences, because it's a risk, but it's sometimes also an opportunity, right? Especially if you meet very nice people. Next. Great. This is the next one. This is also, this is now a strategy that we can work with. And it's something that I have sort of done with my own research. The idea here is to not fall back into your identity and say, oh, this is what Indonesians look at. This is what Indonesians look at in children's literature. This is what Southeast Asians or Filipinos look at in K-pop and so on. Because what happens here, in a global space, the first thing that they will then ask is, so what? I'm not Indonesian. So what? I'm not Filipino, right? You always have to think about your reader. So what you can then offer is the strategy of marginal knowledge. You talk back to them. And and this is actually a successful trend, usually by the Australian model, right? Because they think of Australia is this odd space, right? They're way above there, but they're also stuck far away. So they're sort of like a periphery in their center. And how do we do marginal knowledge? You first begin by actually criticizing the theories, right? Which I wasn't able to see with a lot of the papers I saw before that I was managing. What do we mean by this? A lot of the papers were just passively agreeing to the theory. Trying to understand, and you're trying to replicate the knowledge that this theory is universal. But the reality is it's not. Why? The moment that's where your case study, that's where your study comes in, to test this theory, right? And how are you able to test this theory? Take note, a lot of these theories are constructed by Christian, white scholars. And you, especially the non-Christians in this space, you actually have an advantage because you're now able to say, wait, what are they taught? Will this work if we then apply it to Muslims? Considering that there are nuances and negotiations that you have to work with, right? Or, I'm not sure if Anissa will be talking about later, a lot of our theorists are unfortunately men. So, and that's where gender studies comes in, like, wait, have they even thought about women? And whether this also applies to that. So in other words, that's what you mean when you say you talk back. You tell them that the study about Indonesian K-pop fans is important because it's okay for Muslim women to objectify men, right? We have to remove this idea that, we are a conservative society. We can also, women can also drool. Women can also, engage in this activity, right? Particularly women who are assumed to be conservative, right? And that's when your readers in the global north can then say, I didn't stop to think about that. Because it then opens the idea of how do conservatives then understand this, right? And that's what we mean by talking back. It doesn't mean that you totally disagree with the theory, but what you're trying to look at is you're trying to understand where everything in that theory doesn't fit my study. If it's one small thing, that is also where the gap allows you to be able to engage in. That is where you're now able to ask a new question, right? So, so it's not just how do Indonesians react to religious tolerance, but you then look at the idea. It then opens itself up to larger questions. How do Muslim countries? Or how do women in Muslim countries, or how do rural individuals react to globalized entertainment, right, and food? So there are these types of questions that you're now able to offer. In other words, a strategic question that you have to ask is not to ask the same questions as the global north, right? Because if we play in that game, unfortunately, in most situations, 80 to 90% we lose. Okay? We lose because of our, all of the other things that happen with our spaces. Our Englishes, our geopolitical spaces, the resources accessible to us, and so on. So this is one. Next. All right. The other thing, and this is where I caution. I caution everyone within this space. The other strategy that is involved with is exactly what we in the peripheries tend to work with. We publish in the peripheries. We publish here, right? And I'm not saying it's wrong, right? So that means you're publishing not in English. You're publishing not in a semi-centered language. You're publishing for your country. And it's a nice thing. You publish in Bahasa, you publish in Tetun, you publish in whatever languages your university allows you to publish. It's a check, right? It's a condition that allows you to do this. The nice thing with it is, of course, you now have access to all of the academic resources available to you, which is not accessible to Anglo-American spaces. It can be things such as I don't know, a French theorist that is then translated into Indonesian, a Japanese theorist that's published into Indonesian or Filipino, right? And so on. So, but what makes it interesting, and that's why we have area studies, is it's not only the language, but it's also the understanding of the translator that comes into this picture. Right? So in other words, you are not doing anything wrong. You are not doing anything inferior. Right? But, and you are, as what Belani Sensei mentioned yesterday, you are serving your audience. Right? Your audience are your students, your community, who may not have the same capacities of English, right, or Japanese, or whatever language you have, to be able to read your work. Right? So you are. It's something important. However, it also creates a problem. This is where my concern is. Right? It has the capacity of making us fall into ethno-nationalist spaces. What do we mean by this? Because you are now hyper-focusing on your space. I am an Indonesian Muslim that's going to talk to you about why Muslim fans are reacting this way, and that's why it's important. And what can be a slight problem with it? It essentializes you. It makes your subjects too unique to the point that no one outside of your space would like to read you, right? And just to work with that idea, like why is children's literature on religious tolerance important? Yes, you're using Indonesian sources, but you cannot just put it within the lens of, oh, because this is Indonesia, right? And why does this become a cautionary tale? Because once you publish it in the language that you want to write it in, particularly in Bahasa, your audience will pat you in the back. Excellent work. We need this type of research, right? I love what you've done so far. No one has written about this in this way. So it is that drug that sort of tells you you've done well. But that's where ethno-nationalism comes in, right? That's where radicalism comes in. There is no criticism to you. Right? Because what you've basically written down there is a positivist lens to your country, to your people, right? And I'm not saying that you're always needing to be critical, but you also have to be careful. Step back and look at it in this perspective. Because in some situations, even in our brief conversations yesterday, right? Yes, you are publishing about Indonesia, but sometimes you flatten that experience. It's basically just Java, right? Or whatever, right? So try to also understand who are you reading for, right? You're not there to get praises, but you're there to challenge your ideas with. In other words, you know that you've sort of done a bad job of sorts when no one is actually asking questions, or two, has a differing opinion to you. Right? So that's why even during our sessions today, the point here is not to hope no one asks questions, but to actually hope that you get difficult questions. Because that is where the challenge is. For you to see, I did not think about this in this way because I was too overly immersed in Foucault. Right? Without realizing that there are people that are anti-Foucault. And will then ask this question. And it's not the point of saying I should change my ideas, but it just makes you realize, oh, there is this other reading to my understanding. And whether you accept it and change your article, or whether you stay strong, no, I love Foucault. I sleep with Foucault every night, right? I will die with Foucault if I need to. Then it's up to you. That is your choice. Okay? So there is a need. One of the issues that you have with peripheral research, and I think I see it a lot with the sessions that I had, it becomes too overly empirical. In other words, you're very descriptive. This, right? Normally, I think I made comments to a lot of my lit panel people. You'll see this from the over quotations of paragraphs and paragraphs of lit, right? That happen. Because what happens there? Okay, sure, it's data. It's data that you gathered. But that's not the point. The point here is to make your readers understand what you understood from this data you've gathered, right? It's only, do not be afraid to remove some of that data, because that's when questions happen. Oh, where did you get this idea when you said women are powerful? Oh, you know, in page 57, third paragraph, I actually saw this. So it's in your head, right? You just show enough, but you have that as part of your knowledge, okay? How can you be successful in publishing in the peripheries if you want to choose this path? For Indonesia, it's not a problem, right? Because all you need is a critical mass of people. In other words, if you just want to do Indonesian literature, you know, you can be employed writing only in Indonesia, in Indonesian, writing about Indonesia, right? Any institution, and there are a lot of universities here that can employ you. So that is not a problem. However, if you are in a space where you all now recognize, okay, in my home province there's just one university, right? Will that be enough? So you need a critical mass of scholars to support you. To be able to not only give you a job, but also provide research grants and support for you. And if there is not that critical mass as what I have, it's your decision, right? Do you maintain the space of being in the peripheries, or do you prefer switching departments, right? From Japanese studies, I go to an English department. Or do I go to a history department, right? But again, there is no right or wrong strategy here. It's about you recognizing your space. Right. This is one of the few things that Melanie Sensei actually ended with, right? There's the other strategy, which is you really go off the grid. Where you basically recognize that there are people that do not have the capacities to not only write and record, or even academically express themselves. And you want to engage with this space. It is an important space. And you will be dealing now with being the bridge between that very provincial knowledge. It's a term used by Ben Ali, and it's problematic, but still, I'm just using it now. And what you're then working with here is, in order for it to work, you then now work with the same concept as marginal knowledge. You are trying to make sure why these people are relevant, why this village in the middle of Papua is important for people in Jakarta. Okay? But you're not talking to the Anglo-American centers. You're talking to whichever centers you are in. Okay? But again, take note, we're dealing here with peripheries upon peripheries. And, you know, unfortunately, the sad situation here is that our peripheral centers are much more nasty, right? So much so that one of the things that they will be criticizing you is that, oh, you know, your research, it's a lot of data, but it's unsophisticated, it's unfashionable, it's not, you know, it's not modern. Why? Because a lot of these peripheral centers, they're looking at, have you read Bordeaux, right? Have you read I don't know, whoever is there as a theory? And in most situations, and they're actually much more meaner. They're more meaner than the centers, because the centers sometimes they don't care, right? Whoever, they will use any new theory that's there. But you have to then be ready, because this is their basic arsenal. They are quoting a lot of centrist knowledge. And you now have to construct your research to be able to criticize that centrist knowledge. Okay? Yeah, sure. You are reading Bordeaux, but have you read it in its original French? Right? So in other words, you are then able to engage in that space that their probable understanding of that theory is it's a constructed, it's an interpreted understanding of the theory itself, as opposed to me, who have actually talked to these old ladies in the kampong, who you are now trying to, you know, say, oh, this is theory. They are saying something, and it's you as the scholar that now tries to replicate or engage in that, and make sure that their voices are also important. However, a problem that we have here that you have to be cautious about is you will always meet an outsider, right? And this is especially true for area studies majors. You don't want to be extractive. In other words, you don't go into this community, talk to them, get their attention, and then just get their data. When you choose your topic, you have to make sure that it is not only meaningful to you, but it's also meaningful for that community. And you always go back to that community. Okay. So these are your challenges in that. Next slide. So with provincial knowledge. So, how does this work? Things we need to think about. How am I now going to construct my questions, construct my unique perspective, and so on. The first thing, and I apologize because I have to work with this within the lens of Japanese studies. First is your positionality. Who are you, right? For me, I am a Chinese Filipino. That is born and raised in the Philippines. Right? Which means that my culture, identity, and history is that of the Philippines itself. And if I now engage in Japanese studies, and if I engage in Japanese history, I am bringing with me not the lens of a Japanese scholar, which is my center, but the lens of someone whose history had been engaged in a colonial and violent past. Right? Which means, and just to give an idea with my dissertation was basically looking at the representations of foreigners in boys' magazines from the 1930s to the 1960s. Right? And why is this important? Because this is a pre-war to post-war period. And the question that I asked there was, why did the Japanese actually brutally kill Filipinos? In the same way that we can also say the same thing for Indonesia as well. And how I was able to then approach it is by saying because their children were taught not to look at others, including Filipinos, as human. So, I'm not giving the excuse that the Japanese were okay with it, but this was the education systems that they had. So much so that when the Japanese boys reached the age of 15, they were now able to serve in the army and go to different places in Southeast Asia. And that is where we are able to engage in our experience, our harsh experience. So where is positionality? Where is positionality here? This is something a Japanese historian cannot think about. Because if you look at the literature review for Japanese historians of World War II, they will be focusing primarily on their suffering. And it's something that I'm also angry with a lot of Southeast Asian countries, especially during the time when Barbie and Oppenheimer came to our spaces, right? And if you notice, the young people, what they will talk about is, oh, you know, Oppenheimer, it's a bad movie. Why didn't they just show Grave of the Fireflies, right? Why didn't they show In This Corner of the World? So what happens here was that they were engaged in Japanese apologetics. Because what happens to our youth was that they were now forgetting their own history's victimhood, and they were now positioning themselves to the stronger culture. Look at how Japan suffered during these atomic bombs. I cried for this anime. And then I'm like, with my students I was telling, then why are you not crying for us? Right? And I'm not saying you should be angry for the Japanese. I'm actually more angry about the situation. Because the positionality is not placed there. And if you look at it, my scholarship, and I know it's still a difficult thing to be proud of it, as most people are, is that I'm not trying to be angry to Japan. I'm not going to say, oh, no, we have to burn all of these people, right? We have to, whenever Japanese, tourists come here, we tell them, oh, you killed my parents! Of course not. The idea of this is to understand that and to understand your space. Yes, there was a time when a lot of Filipinos were angry, but we have developed a relationship with them afterwards. It becomes interesting because Indonesia has the same trajectory as the Philippines. Japan is always our friend despite the bad things that they have done to us. And it's about us not correcting that event, but actually understanding then why. How did we shift into this space? And in most situations, it's not actually Japan at fault. It's actually our national histories, which have focused primarily on ethno-nationalism. So in other words, we were more engaged in wanting to be free from our Western colonizers. And that the moment that we were free, we didn't care anymore. Right? So, it's things to work with positionalities. Your positionality is you are either whatever your gender is, whatever your ethno-linguistic group is. There are so many things that are there. So if you jump into a topic, I don't know if your research, and I hope I'm not making some of the teachers that teach methodologies here angry. Whenever I hear people say you have to be objective in your research, no. You begin with bias. You begin with what makes you angry. But rather than be involved in like, oh, I hate all of this, I hate Foucault, kill all of the Foucauldians, right? And so on. No, the idea here is doing that then makes you ask, so who are the people that are critical to this topic? Read them. Read their arguments. Are you convinced by their arguments? So much so that, and that was why part of what I did for my panel was, I forced most of the papers, make your stand. As young, I know you're still beginning with your research, you're still a little bit wishy-washy of which you want to go, but the point here is make a point, make a decision. I believe that, I believe that queer people are this. I believe that religious tolerance education is this. Because that's your conclusion. You cannot go to your class and say, oh, you can be racist and not racist at the same time, because that's objective, right? So that's the point. You have to come in with bias, but temper your bias with your research. So much so that when people then ask you a question, you recognize that it is a gap that you haven't read. It makes you also recognize how deep in your bias you are, or how lacking in bias you have become. The other thing here, as I mentioned, is always recognize all of the theories that you have engaged in does not consider you, has never considered us. And unfortunately, unless they are in Indonesian studies, but it also has a problem, they will never, they will never look at you. So all of these theories that you have cited, then you are trying to apply them to an Indonesian lens, or even to a linguistic lens, already has problems because you are reading it as an Indonesian scholar with your analytical exercises as an Indonesian scholar. Your backgrounds, your positionalities are now very different. And it's not to remove that, but to then push that. This is my reading. Okay? This is how I understood it, and this is how I was able to construct my arguments. Or a dangerous path, which if you are much more ready to do, you can actually then do what a lot of the decolonial scholars are doing. You drop all of them altogether. And then recognize who is this Indonesian scholar that, that is important, that no one is even citing and quoting. Because I like this person's ideas. And just to give that interesting concept, I only learned about ethno-nationalism from an Indian Malay scholar who I just recently read for 30 rupiah. So cheap, right? But what he did for research was actually do a criticism of national histories in Malaysia using their curriculums and accusing it as being very ethno-nationalist, ethno-religio-nationalist, right? Which also becomes a topic. So we're like, hey, I never thought about that. This is interesting. No one cites this person. Had a very interesting point. So might as well, right? Because sometimes it's that. These are these interesting people that you read. Right? Next is, think about your audience. I think this is what Melanie Sensei had already mentioned yesterday. Who are you writing for? Specifically, why are you doing this research? If you want American or European or Australian scholars to read you, then the strategy there is to remove your identity. I'm not saying it's wrong. But if that is your choice, that is your strategy. You talk like them, you write like them, you cite all of their citations like them. Because that's the only way that you will be read by them. Okay? However, if you are then looking at, if you're looking at Japan, their citation, their writing practices, it's also very different. So try to understand where you are submitting to. Right? What type of language, who are they reading, who are they writing about, right? And you know, when you say, wait, how do I know this? Well, you just Google. Because, for example, if you Google Melanie Sensei's name, and you see her being published in these journals, and you see that her bibliography also includes a lot of Indonesian authors in it. That's not just extractive, meaning you're not just taking, you're not just looking at them as data, but them as theory. Then you do know that this is a journal that is friendly to you, right? If you read this person, doesn't have to be Indonesian, right? And is published in this space, then you are then able to see, okay, this is the type of ideas they are working with. Okay? So I'm not saying that you should aim for high quality journals, but the important thing here is to aim for where you want to be read. A lot of my publications are in Japanese and are not in Scopus ISI journals, because part of why I write is to make Japanese realize that, you know, there's more to Southeast Asia and World War II history than just we were killed and raped, right? So I engaged in that space. Does that give me points for my university? No. But that is also a choice that I make. It doesn't mean it's a choice that you have to make, but it's a choice that you have to get ready with. Okay? The last thing here is you also have to then be careful with colonial knowledge. I think I see it a little bit with some of your research that's happening, and it's not being critical to it, but try to also understand our generational cycles. So a lot of your professors, even myself, even if all of these decolonial scholars will say, cite Indonesian, cite Filipino, cite Malaysian, the problem here is I wasn't taught like that. And unfortunately and unconsciously, I will just write as a reading list for most of my students. Okay, read this. One of my favorite authors is Tessa Moore Suzuki, right? Australian, because it's part of the background that I've been in. But at the same time, you also have to then be critical of your teachers' reading lists, because they then impose on you the biases that they have. You don't walk to your faculty and say, you know, your reading list is wrong. Of course not, they'll fail you. But the idea here is try to understand that there is flaws to their arguments. Okay? Try to read the readings critically as well. And in some situations for me, I actually get interesting reading lists from my students during their reports. So much so that I now was able to understand that North Korea has a piracy market on K-pop that comes from the borders of Dandong, right? So there's this interesting relationships that happen there, and you know, how I wouldn't have thought about it because I'm not in the Hallyu wave, right? But it also means that there are things that my students, you are probably reading, But it also means that you also have to be adventurous in your reading. Don't just go to the experts, don't just go to the big people. Because what happens in that space is that you are just being a derivative of a derivative. You will just keep on repeating, oh, you know, this is a case study of Java children's literature. Then you go to, then there's this, I will do another thing about case study on Surabaya children's literature, right? And then Teton children's literature. So, in other words, you're just replicating the same process all over again. And you're not developing. So much so that maybe it's these interesting people. When I just type things randomly, like, I don't know, prostitution in Japan and male. When I had that search, I was able to see that one of the labor migrants in Japan that's actually quite famous right now is a Filipino porn star in Japan who's male. And they're like, but then, you know, it becomes material. And then I'm able to tell that we're not just looking at sexual migration from a gendered lens of women, but we're now able to see that, and it's not even just male straight, it's queer. It's queer migration. So, you know, and then it engages into new questions. So these are things that I challenge you with. So much so that my last slide will be, that's the important thing. Who are we? And for whom are we studying? The last question that I asked there is what Melanie Santre had mentioned yesterday. Your research question, your research topic cannot just be a whim. Okay? Your interest in queer studies, your interest in children's literature, your interest in linguistic theories is because you have seen a social problem. You see in the daily lives of yourselves that, oh, why are they doing this? Why are these, people dressing in this awful way? Why can't they dress well? And you're trying to understand that problem. Okay? Because if you don't have any meaning or any concept to your, any reason to your research, that is what Melanie Sanz had mentioned. That is where your struggle begins, because you have no passion for that research. You're just doing it because it's currently the trend. And that's why it becomes a struggle. So going back, why did I start my dissertation and my master's on children's literature? Because I was, for one, positionality. I recognized I was stupid and lazy. So as a historian who needs to be in the archive for ages, right, and months, I said, that is not the life I want to live. So what did I do? I thought, what type of material would allow me to sit for 17 hours just enjoying reading this? And the only thing I saw was children's literature. Because the maximum number of texts in children's literature is around 500 to 1,000 words. So I don't have to read a lot. Right? Most of the pages have pictures. So I'm like, And the other thing, which becomes a critical response, is my field does not believe that children's literature is an important historical source, despite the fact that it exists in this space. So, and with this, I am now able to not only create a niche, but also, it's an unfortunate peripheral niche, because what happens is the children's lit people will say, you're not doing proper children's lit, because you're not citing children's lit theory, right? And the historians will say, why are you looking at this garbage? But that's my choice. I was lucky enough to be able to engage in it, but it's not something that I wish for everyone as well. And with that, I do hope that you have questions. Thanks.
Okay, questions time. You can ask questions in Indonesian or in English. Yes, please, ma'am. State your name and your question.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Karl. Thank you for your inspiring talk. My name is Role Esther, and I am from Ph.D. I'm sorry for not joining from the beginning of your talk, so maybe you have already talked about it, but can you elaborate more about how can we make a space as a Southeast Asian scholar, like from where we have to start, or what is the most important thing to prepare? Because like yesterday Melanie said, I have experienced that I went to conference, but I can't talk to anyone because I am afraid. I feel I'm not qualified enough, like that. So, but at the same time, I want to engage and I want to discuss, but I don't know where to start. So maybe if you can give some tips or some strategy to like break the ice. Thank you.
You go early. Next question. Yes, state your name, please.
Good morning, thank you, Karl. My name is Karl. Actually, I have already written my question, so okay, I will read it. This chip. Okay, Karl. If I understand it, in the context of Indonesian academia, a good research article is often judged by the success of its outcomes. It seems that there is a strong emphasis on ensuring that the result yields a successful result for it to be meaningful. Means that the findings are successful, it's meaningful. Okay. What are your thoughts on this perspective? What do you think? I mean, there is something problems or issue with this approach. Okay, thank you.
One more, maybe.
Yeah. All right. So first, two questions. If everyone asks other questions, hopefully we can ask them. But for the question of this, actually, it engages in a lot of risk. So first thing I do is I sort of act in the somewhat same way as the colonial scholars, in the sense I don't go to big conferences. I hate them. What they mean by this, for Asian studies, it's always going to be AAS in Asia, unfortunately, ASAA, and so on. Why? First and foremost, understanding these conferences, these are global North scholars conferences. In other words, as what I've mentioned, they don't care about you. They won't go to you and say, what is this Indonesian scholar going to talk about, tales of Genji? I want to listen because it's interesting. Of course not. That's a reality. And part of the problem there is that it's so expensive, right? AAS itself is $500. Where am I going to get $500 on the government scholar, the government salary in the Philippines, right? From the very beginning, even Raleigh knows this. Even when Japan Foundation says, "Oh, we're going to fund you to this," unfortunately I'm the mean person that says, "Don't. You're wasting money." So what do? I actually look for smaller conferences like this. Not that I look for this. I'm happy that I'm invited here. Why? Because what happens? We're small enough, and I'd like to think that everyone is listening. Everyone is interested. You're coming here because you are genuinely wanting to learn. these types of conferences are meaningful? Will they tick the box that I went to, I went to the US and presented in this conference? No, it's really do mean to and the nice thing there is people approach you and you can approach them. You'll be able to see it in these types of small conferences. The other thing is, do not box yourself to your discipline. So as a Japanese studies as a Japanese studies scholar, I don't just go to Japanese studies conferences. I think this is what Melanie Sensei mentioned yesterday. Think of your keywords. So where can I go? I actually go to children's literatures conferences, because even if I do children's literature, but the important thing here is no one in children's literature conferences talks about anything but American and English children's literature. So you become an interest. Oh, so this is what they're talking about, right? And it sort of attracts you to them. I also go to war conferences. In war conferences, it's all of these testosterone that talk about they killed this, they killed that, we use this tank to destroy this place and so on. And I tell them, but, even in war, and this is what one of my advisees in the Philippines did. Even in war, idiotic Filipinos still have beauty pageants. Right? Because we cannot help but always go back to a Miss Universe in war, right? But, it becomes the foil, like, this person is interesting because they are writing something that we would not have even questioned or looked at. Okay? I also go to education conferences because one of the important, these are just stereotypes that I have. Education conferences, especially in Southeast Asia, is hyper-focused on pedagogy. How do we teach our students well? What is the dangers of AI and so on? Standard stuff. And I'm not going to demean it. And what happens? I position myself as someone that looks at children's literature as informal education. What do I mean by this? The existence of it is important because how we teach in a formal classroom is boring. And the only way for our students to learn is to actually take on a lot of these informal educational systems, wherein it can be either comics, manga, literature, music, and so on. So you'll notice a lot of your students are actually picking up their linguistic skills not from class, but actually from popular culture. And it changes the crowd. Oh, how do we then create a method for this? I said, there is no method for this. You cannot quantify this. Stop thinking like an education major, right? So it becomes that interesting thing. So in other words, for me, go to think about your keywords and go to these conferences even if you don't think that you can. Right? I can go to a science and I can go to a science conference and look at science fiction. Right? And tell them this is how science is actually being translated. Because that's one of their struggles. How to translate, how to make a lot of things easy. So, it's that. And in most situations, they are interested enough to invite you to a special issue. Right? So, go outside of your spaces. Try to see the keywords that you're there and be confident. Right? You do know that you are a gender, you do know that you're a lit person, but how are you now able to translate this study into something else? That's what I think Melanie Sensei also mentioned yesterday. The world now is about interdisciplinary research, transdisciplinary research, and so on. Right? So I'd rather go to these conferences. And the nice thing about these small conferences is, after that, they will always go to, they will also have like these free tours. So it actually, and you're stuck with someone beside you that you've never talked about. They're like, what is your research about? Oh, that's why I engaged with Anissa, like talk to her about her research and so on, because maybe in the future I can actually do research with her, right? Maybe there's a theory that I can use, right? So sorry, long answer. For the second question regarding outcomes, there is a question here regarding what you mean by outcomes. Unfortunately, that's where my caution to ethno-nationalism comes in. Because if you publish about, how Nusantara is important to Indonesian literature, all of the nationalists will be like, bravo! Great that you've done all of this research. But yes, it's successful, but is it meaningful? You've just basically fed the egos of ultra-nationalists or something, right? So, but the important thing here is to try to understand outcomes within your own terms. If you are doing study on children's literature, you are then looking at it as to how is it actually, how are children actually reading it? And that's why a lot of the people that did children's literature, the first thing that's important to me with children's literature is a lot of the time, the voice is actually in the voice of the adult. And in most situations, it's not actually a literature for the children, but it's basically for the adults that are dealing with their child's problem. And that's not, to me, that's a problem in children's literature. Right? And that's where outcomes come in. You're able to recognize this so that when I give this talk, and in Petra, it's going to be one of the talks that I'll be dealing with, you then engage with industry. Why aren't our books working? It's not working because who is your main character? Who is your main character? Your main character is this, Ibu that's going to have 15 lines telling you why you need to be a good Muslim. Number 1. Number 2. And is that interesting if you let a child read it? No. It's the same thing as their class. Right? It's passive learning. Okay? So that is where you see outcome. And that's why you also have to question these merits. So much so that when they say, oh, you have to publish in top-tier journals, yeah, you were able, let's say you were lucky enough to be able to publish in a #1 Scopus ISI journal for your discipline. But, publishing is one thing, being cited is another. And the other issue there is, yes, part of the struggle here is a lot of people that we want to read us can't even afford to read us. Okay? And that's where outcomes is. So much so that when I don't even care about my H index and so on. Right? If people ask me, like for my article, sure, give it to you. Because the important thing here is, and it's not for me to just, increase my citations, but it's also to see that, wait, I think you're wrong in this, in what you mentioned here, right? And to me, it challenges me. So that's when we end with outcome, you have to also understand what your outcomes, what you want as your outcome. If you want to empower women, are they empowered after your research? Right. Thanks. Questions?
One last question.
Yes.
Yes, take your name, please, ma'am.
Hello, Pak Karl. Very nice to see you, by the way. And I get more insight how do I think globally from this activity. Pak Karl, actually, you started your topic with geopolitical inequalities in academics. If I continue my sentence, geopolitical inequalities in academic when exploring sensitive issue. Okay, so I'm just curious because My target is European journal, and I'm talking about a sensitive issue for the certain countries, Palestine and Israel, alright? And I am talking about a certain concept that's a very, very dirty word in international relation perspective. So how do you see this one? If we are using the critical method and critical concept, I mean the theory, but we go further with the critical social, the social problem. What we are going to see right now is the problem about the inhumanity. Okay, what do you see? How do you see the situation for the certain academic journal in European countries? Thank you.
Great, thank you. There are two ways to do this from what I've observed. And that's why, on the one hand, decolonization and decolonial projects are important. But on the other hand, I caution you if you explore that space, because basically it's angry research, and you are not targeting a particular audience, right? You're just wanting, and that's what we see with a lot of social media. It's basically just either developing a lot of anger, or developing a lot of unstructured or unthought about emotive responses. Okay? I'm not saying it's wrong, but if that is the path you want to work with, then go ahead. It's going to might be difficult, but there will always be spaces for it, because there are radical journals. They exist for these spaces, and there are also radical journals. Not saying that what your topic is radical, but there are these spaces where they are quite open to them. So it's about studying the journal. So much so that if you know that this journal does not have a profile that publishes anti positions, then you know that you're dooming yourself to it from the very beginning. The second strategy is, I think, what I mentioned as marginal knowledge. You do recognize the problem here, but your point is you have something and you want to converse with these people, despite the fact that your space is problematic, right? Or no, not problematic. Your space is contrary to them. It's a struggle for me, but here is an example that I can give, because I can't really talk much about the Palestine one, unfortunately, because I'm not in a position for that. For the Philippines, one of the important things that we have is comfort women issues, right? And we follow the Korean model, which is somewhat similar: anger, Japan has to pay, and so on and so forth. Think about the women, and so on and so forth, right? But by doing so, what happens here is it will immediately be rejected by Japan, simply because they already know your dialogue. They already know what your talking points are, and they know what your conclusion is. Japan has to apologize, Japan has to give money, and so on and so forth. So what happens here is there's no progression. There's no development to this scholarship. You're patting yourselves in both sides of the back. Understanding my positionality. I'm cisgender male. I'm post-war generation. I'm a Japanese studies professor. So what happens here is I now try to engage in this space by recognizing that recently the UN Center for Human Rights had actually came out with a proposal that said that the Philippine government has a problem with its comfort women, simply because we have not integrated comfort women histories in our textbooks, nor did we recognize our comfort women as, for lack of a better term, veterans. So in other words, because they are also victims of the war, they are now forced. They do not get national pension or compensation. So, how do I now engage in this topic? It's a controversial topic, but I'm now trying to write a paper, problematic, on before we even talk to Japan, we have to first recognize these comfort women as nationals. Why? Because in the last space of us dealing with comfort women, we were only understanding them as individuals, which means, unfortunately, from a gendered lens, we have looked at the comfort women problem as rape. In other words, it's an individual issue.